It was 9:47 a.m. when Walter Brooks walked into the pristine marble lobby of Landmark Federal Bank, a large burlap sack slung over his shoulder. His faded flannel shirt hung loose on his frail frame, and his worn-out boots echoed awkwardly on the polished floor. Conversation stopped. Eyes narrowed. A security guard instinctively placed a hand on his holster. Walter didn't flinch. He stepped toward the front desk, the sack swaying with each step, and calmly asked to see the branch manager. The receptionist hesitated, barely hiding her smirk. "Sir, do you have an appointment?" Walter nodded. "No, but they'll want to hear what I got to say. I own this bank." Laughter erupted. A young man in a tailored suit snorted so loud he nearly choked on his latte. "You own this bank?" he scoffed. "Right, and I'm the president." Walter stood there, silent, eyes steady, calm as a man who knew something they didn't. Within the hour, every single person who laughed would be silenced, not by force, but by truth and regret. Because Walter wasn't crazy, he was right. And the sack he carried? It held a story that would rewrite every assumption they had ever made. Before we reveal the truth that left an entire bank in silence, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell. These are real stories they don't want you to hear. Raw, powerful, unforgettable. Join a community that sees what others ignore. Don't miss what's coming next. It's closer than you think. Walter Brooks was born in 1953 in a forgotten corner of Macon, Georgia, the kind of place where dreams were small because survival came first. His mother, Martha, worked as a maid for white families and raised him alone after his father vanished before Walter could walk. They lived in a one-room house with a tin roof that clattered like gunfire every time it rained. He never got past 7th grade, not because he couldn't learn, but because he had to work. At age 10, he was collecting glass bottles and scrap metal before dawn. By 15, he was hauling cardboard in a pushcart across the dusty streets of Atlanta. Life hardened his hands, but not his heart. Walter loved reading. He found discarded newspapers and magazines in trash bins and read them cover to cover. Finance sections, op-eds, business news. He didn't always understand, but he kept reading. He'd sit on curbs and repeat headlines to himself like prayers. He believed in something most had lost, that knowledge, dignity, and quiet perseverance could still mean something in a world that often refused to see him. He never begged, never stole. Every penny he earned was saved, sometimes hidden under floorboards, sometimes wrapped in coffee cans. Decades passed, and the world changed. But Walter remained, unnoticed, underestimated, invisible. He didn't own a suit, didn't own a car, but he owned something more powerful, a purpose that had taken root in him when he saw his mother humiliated for trying to cash her own paycheck. She whispered that night, "They can take everything, baby, but don't ever let them take your dignity." Walter never forgot that. He never married, never had children, but he dreamed of building something no one could take from him. A place that people like his mother wouldn't be laughed out of. A place where respect wasn't a luxury. And so, for 50 years, in silence and shadows, he built toward that dream. Until one day, with a sack over his shoulder, he walked into the very institution that once denied him and said the words no one expected, "I own this bank." Walter's dream didn't start in a bank or a courtroom. It started in a kitchen, with his mother standing over a boiling pot of beans, telling him stories of men she read about in magazines she cleaned up after. "These white men," she'd say, "they own things, Walter, land, buildings, banks. They don't ask for help, they give it. You hear me, baby?" That's the difference. That idea took root. It wasn't about being rich. It was about not needing to beg. About creating something that couldn't be taken away with a laugh or a locked door. Through the years, Walter kept saving. He'd cash checks from recycling plants and keep only what he needed. The rest went into old mason jars hidden beneath loose floorboards or inside hollowed-out encyclopedias. When the local library shut down, he asked to take the outdated finance books no one wanted. He read them every night under a flickering bulb. He learned about compound interest, credit unions, community reinvestment. He taught himself what APR meant, how banks lend money, how they profit. The more he read, the more he saw one painful truth. The system wasn't built for people like him. It locked them out with silent rules and smiling faces. So he vowed to build something different. When he was in his 60s, he found a neglected building in a struggling Atlanta neighborhood, an old bank that had been shut down during the 2008 crash. Broken windows, peeling paint. But to Walter it was gold. He pooled his savings, bought the property outright in a private sale, and began the slow, back-breaking work of restoring it. He didn't have contractors. He had a hammer, a ladder, and faith. He envisioned a small, community-owned credit bank that would offer low-interest loans to people denied by traditional banks. No credit, no problem. Collateral? He'd trust character. People thought he was delusional. Friends told him to enjoy his old age, maybe move into a senior center. But Walter wasn't finished. He registered the business under the name Freedom First Community Lending, paying every fee in cash. He printed flyers, told neighbors, even got a small write-up in a local paper, but no one paid much attention until he went to file his deed and the resistance began, because someone else had noticed the old building too, a corporation, a powerful one, and they didn't like the idea of a ragged black man owning what they believed should be theirs. Walter arrived at the county clerk's office early, wearing his cleanest clothes and holding a worn folder with every document he had: property deed, proof of purchase, tax receipts, business registration. He waited patiently for his turn, his heart steady. This was the moment, the official recognition that Freedom First Community Lending was real. But when he handed over his documents, the clerk squinted at the papers, then at Walter. "Sir, this property is under review. We've had a corporate interest file a claim of previous entitlement." Walter frowned. "Ma'am, I bought it legal, cash. Right here." He gently tapped the deed with a calloused finger. "I understand, but you'll need to speak with legal." Legal turned out to be a tight-lipped man in a suit named Mr. Keller, who represented a national bank chain, South Point Financial. They had been trying to reacquire the old building for months, seeing potential in gentrifying the neighborhood. But Walter had beaten them to the sale. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Overnight, Walter began receiving letters, court notices, claims that the original sale was invalid, that he didn't meet zoning requirements, that his deed might be fraudulent. Local inspectors showed up unannounced, finding hazards in the building. Every step forward was met with two back. Then came the whispers. "That old man. He's crazy. You heard he's trying to open a bank. With what money? They say he sleeps in there." Even people he thought he knew began avoiding him. When he walked into stores, employees watched him. He heard snickers when he passed teenagers. Once, he found the words "Fraud King" spray-painted across the boarded-up windows of his building. Still, he kept going. One morning, a well-dressed man showed up. Richard Mallory, a regional executive for South Point. He was polite. Too polite. He offered Walter $200,000 in cash to walk away. "Let us clean this place up, Mr. Brooks," he said, voice syrupy. "You'll retire comfortable. Don't waste your twilight chasing pipe dreams." Walter looked at him, then at the building behind them. "This ain't a pipe dream. This is my legacy." Richard's smile faded. "Then I guess we'll see you in court." And they did. For months, Walter was buried in paperwork, hearings, delays. The system he studied for decades now turned its full weight against him. He showed up to every meeting alone. No lawyer, just his documents and his resolve. And while the city rolled its eyes and corporations sharpened their knives, Walter, old, quiet, forgotten, prepared for the fight of his life. Winter in Atlanta bit harder than usual that year, and the cold seeped through the cracks of the old bank building like it was trying to push Walter out. He'd moved into the structure after his modest apartment raised the rent beyond what he could afford, thanks to the same gentrification that was trying to erase him. Now he slept on a cot behind the teller booths, wrapped in donated blankets, his breath visible in the dark. His food came from shelters, and showers were a luxury. Still, Every morning he shaved with a dull razor and walked to the courthouse with his documents in hand. Each hearing was the same: delays, objections, rescheduling. Lawyers from South Point showed up in fleets, briefcases polished, suits sharper than knives. Walter came alone, in silence, carrying truth on crumpled paper. No one seemed to hear him. One day, a judge glanced at his file and chuckled softly. "Mr. Brooks, do you even understand these legal claims?" Walter stood, spine straight. "I understand I bought that building fair and square. I understand when I give my word. It means something." Laughter echoed softly from the back of the room, not loud, just enough to let him know what they thought of him. After court, he walked back under a grey sky. A boy on a bike passed and shouted, "Hey, old man, your bank's a joke." That night, Walter sat in the cold, clutching his mother's old Bible. He flipped through it, not looking for scripture but for her note, folded between Psalms and Proverbs. She'd written it before she passed. "If they shut the door, go through the window. And if they close the window, dig a new way in. Don't you ever stop, Walter." He wept. But even his tears had grown dry with time. He wasn't just tired. He was bone-deep weary. He hadn't spoken to a friend in weeks. He'd become a ghost, talked about, mocked, but never truly seen. Then came the night his hope nearly broke. It was after a particularly brutal court day. The judge had ruled in favor of a temporary injunction, meaning Walter could no longer legally work on or inside the building until further review. He stood on the steps of the courthouse, watching the sky turn to ash. His knees buckled. He sat there for hours, ignored by every passerby. He thought about leaving, about selling, about simply disappearing. But before he did, something happened. A car pulled up beside the building that night. A woman stepped out, young, black, dressed in jeans and a leather coat. She knocked on the boarded-up front door. Walter opened it slowly, prepared for confrontation. But the woman just smiled. "Mr. Brooks, my name's Imani Carter. I'm a lawyer, and I read everything about your case." He blinked. "I believe you," she said. Those 3 words hit harder than the lawsuits, the graffiti, the sneers. They cracked something in him. Not pain this time, but a sliver of light. Imani continued, "My grandfather worked 3 jobs and was never able to open a bank account. He died believing people like us would always be outsiders. But I think he was wrong. I think you are proof he was wrong." Walter stared at her, stunned, like she'd dropped from the sky. "I want to help," she added, "free of charge if you'll let me." And just like that, in the coldest part of his journey, when even hope seemed to have packed up and left, Walter found a reason to stay standing. Not because he wasn't tired, but because he wasn't alone anymore. If this story is already stirring something in you, memories, questions, maybe even anger, pause for a moment. Like the video, leave a comment below. Your voice matters here. Every share, every word helps stories like Walter's rise from silence, because sometimes all it takes is one voice to change everything. The next morning felt different. For the first time in months, Walter didn't walk to the courthouse alone. Imani Carter walked beside him, her briefcase clutched tight, her stride full of purpose. She had spent the entire night combing through his documents, checking every date, every stamp, every signature. And what she found stunned her. "Walter," she said, stopping him on the courthouse steps, "they messed up. There's a clause in the 2009 property seizure documents they never cleared with the city. Your purchase isn't just legal, it's bulletproof." Walter didn't say a word, but his lips trembled slightly, as if fighting to keep his emotions inside. That day in court, Imani spoke for him. Clear, confident, surgical. She quoted zoning laws, cited precedent, dismantled South Point's argument line by line. The courtroom, used to brushing Walter off, now leaned forward in their seats. After the hearing, Walter and Imani sat on the curb outside. "You fight like you've been doing this your whole life," Walter said. "I have," she replied, "just didn't know it would matter this much." Walter looked at her, really looked. In her eyes, he saw his mother. In her fire, he saw a version of himself, younger, unbroken. That night, something shifted inside him. For months, he had fought out of obligation, pride, anger. But now, he was fighting with hope. He cleaned out the old building, even if he wasn't legally allowed to work inside. He swept the steps. He repainted the wooden sign, Freedom First Community Lending. He placed it proudly in the window. People started stopping by again, not to mock, but to ask questions, to offer help. A young artist painted a mural of Walter and his mother on the side of the building. A retired carpenter dropped off tools. A teenage girl left flowers at the doorstep with a note. "My mama says thank you." Walter read that note 10 times before folding it and placing it in the Bible beside his mother's. He was still poor, still alone most nights, but inside something had changed. He no longer felt invisible, because now his fight wasn't just about a building, it was about dignity, about generations, about proving that even a man with nothing but a sack on his back could be the cornerstone of something greater. And for the first time in a long, long while, Walter believed again. The injunction was lifted a month later. A judge finally acknowledged the errors in South Point's claim and allowed Walter to resume his work on the building. It wasn't a full victory. Not yet. But it was movement. And for Walter, movement was enough. He and Imani stood on the front steps that morning, staring up at the battered brick facade. "You ready?" she asked. Walter nodded. "Been ready for 50 years. The inside of the building was a mess. Water stains on the ceiling, exposed wiring, rotten floorboards. But Walter didn't see damage. He saw opportunity. Every nail he hammered, every wall he patched, felt like he was reclaiming a piece of himself. Word spread through the neighborhood. People began to stop by, not out of curiosity, but with purpose. A group of retired veterans offered to help rebuild. A woman from down the block brought lunch every other day. Kids asked if they could paint. Walter, the invisible man, had become a symbol, not of charity, but of pride. With Imani handling the legal groundwork, Walter focused on the heart of the project. He didn't want a cold financial institution. He wanted a space with warmth, a community room for financial literacy classes, walls lined with books instead of advertisements, a place where no one would be turned away for the way they looked or the balance in their pocket. He designed every corner himself. "This," he'd tell anyone who asked, "ain't just a bank. It's a second chance." One afternoon, while scrubbing years of grime from the front door, a man approached wearing a suit, clean-cut, polite. "Mr. Brooks, I'm with South Point's acquisition department. I've been sent to offer you a final deal." Walter didn't even look up. "You're wasting your time." The man pulled a letter from his jacket. $750,000. That's our offer. Walk away. No more lawsuits, no more stress." Walter wiped his hands, took the envelope, and held it up to the light. Then he slowly tore it in half. "You can't buy what you never helped build," he said. The man left. Walter turned back to the door and kept scrubbing. It wasn't about stubbornness, it was about principle. This building, this dream, had been paid for in decades of sweat, silence, and resilience. No dollar amount could equal that. Progress was slow, painful, but real. And for the first time, Walter wasn't building alone. He was building with a community that finally saw him. Reconstruction was never a straight path. Just when Walter thought they were gaining momentum, something would go wrong. Pipes burst in the back office. Mold crept in behind the drywall. Then the city inspector returned with a new list of safety concerns. A full page of bureaucratic red tape designed to delay them again. Walter sat on the front steps that day, the list crumpled in his hand. "Feels like they're moving the goalposts every time we get close," he muttered. Imani sat beside him. "They are, but that just means we're scaring them." Still, the weight of it all began to wear him down. His body ached more. His hands, once strong and precise, now shook when gripping tools. One morning, he collapsed in the hallway, dizzy and dehydrated. Imani rushed him to the clinic. The doctor warned him plainly, "You need to slow down. Your body's not 20 anymore." Walter nodded, But deep down, he knew he couldn't afford to slow down. Not now. They cut back hours. Volunteers took over much of the manual labor. Imani managed permits, grants, and licensing with relentless focus. But Walter couldn't sit still. He wandered the building each night, checking progress, touching the walls like they held his memories. That's when the doubts began to creep in. Was this really worth it? Would the system always find a new way to shut him out? Late one evening, while locking up, he saw graffiti again. Fresh paint across the mural on the side wall. "Stay in your place." He stared at it for a long time. But this time, he didn't cry, didn't crumble. Instead, he grabbed a brush and painted over it himself. By sunrise, the wall bore new words in bold blue paint. "We belong here." That message lit something in the community. People began leaving messages on the windows, post-it notes, letters, hand-drawn signs. Children wrote, "Thank you, Mr. Walter," in crayon. A church group offered to sponsor the community room. A black-owned construction firm volunteered to finish the ceiling work. Setback by setback, they pressed forward. Walter wasn't the same man who once walked in with a sack over his shoulder. He was now the heartbeat of a growing movement, an anchor in a storm that had tried to drown him. The dream wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed in second chances, and that made it worth every scar. It was the day of the final court hearing, the one that would decide everything: ownership, legality, the right to exist. Walter stood outside the courthouse, a simple black coat draped over his shoulders, a cap pulled low over his eyes. Imani stood beside him, papers in hand, eyes fierce. Inside, the courtroom was full. Reporters lined the back wall. Members of the community filled the benches. Mothers, students, retired workers, even city officials. Some held signs, "Let freedom stand," and "Justice for Walter Brooks." Across the aisle, Richard Mallory adjusted his tie, confident. His lawyers whispered and chuckled as they always did. To them, this was routine, another land dispute, another obstacle to remove. But this time, Walter had an army. Judge Evelyn Marsh entered. The room stood. Silence settled in. Imani began her argument. She spoke of legal rights, historical bias, the systemic denial of access to property and capital. But more than that, she told Walter's story. She painted a picture of a man who had followed every law, paid every fee, and still was told no at every turn because of who he was and what he looked like. She ended with a single sentence. "Dignity," she said, "should not require a suit or a title. Sometimes it walks in wearing boots and carrying a sack." A hush fell over the room. Then South Point's lawyers presented their case: procedural, coal, irregularities in zoning, conflicting intentions, public interest. It was all by the book. Judge Marsh leaned forward. "I've reviewed all documents," she said, "and I see no legal grounds to void Mr. Brooks's ownership. The sale was legitimate. The permits were valid. This court finds in favor of the defendant, Walter Brooks." Gasps. Applause. Mallory's face paled. Walter stood slowly, eyes wet, chest rising with each breath. He turned to Imani, who smiled and whispered, "You did it." "No," Walter said, voice shaking. "We did." Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions, but Walter ignored them. He walked straight into the middle of the crowd, his people, and raised a fist. The same fist that once picked through trash now stood as a symbol of victory. A week later, Freedom First Community Lending opened its doors. Walter wore a second-hand suit, donated by a local tailor who had once laughed at him. Now he stood beside the same man, both smiling. Richard Mallory showed up uninvited that day, stiff, awkward. He pulled Walter aside. "I wanted to say," he began. Walter raised a hand. "You don't have to," Mallory nodded. Then, surprisingly, reached into his pocket and pulled out a check, donation to the community fund. Walter took it, looked him in the eyes and said, "This time it'll go to the right people." The bank wasn't grand. No marble floors, no digital screens. But it was alive. Children ran through the lobby. Elders came to open accounts. Young entrepreneurs came to learn, to dream. And at the center of it all, behind a wooden desk, sat Walter, not a CEO, not a banker, but a man who had turned silence into voice, humiliation into honor, a man who had been laughed at, until they had no choice but to listen. Walter Brooks never intended to be a hero. He didn't march in protests or lead movements. He simply refused to disappear. And in that quiet defiance, he taught something powerful. That dignity isn't handed out. It's claimed. Walter's journey revealed how society still measures worth by appearance, how people are often dismissed not because of what they lack, but because of what others refuse to see in them. A man in old clothes carrying a burlap sack couldn't possibly be a property owner, right? Let alone the founder of a bank. But Walter didn't shout for recognition. He didn't demand to be seen. He just kept showing up. Every closed door, every insult, every setback, he answered with presence, with truth, with resilience. And in doing so, he became a mirror for everyone who had ever been ignored, laughed at, or told they didn't belong. His story reminds us that justice isn't just won in courts. It's won in the day-to-day acts of courage, in the refusal to surrender. He taught a city that greatness doesn't always come in suits or sit in corner offices. Sometimes it comes from the man who walks in quietly and says something that shakes the room. I own this bank. And he meant every word. Months after the grand opening of Freedom First Community Lending, Walter Brooks became a quiet legend in his community. His name was printed in newspapers across the country. Local news called him the man who changed the rules. But Walter didn't care about fame. He still walked to work every morning, stopping to chat with neighbors, checking in on kids outside the corner store. He'd sit in the community room of his bank, sipping sweet tea, while young people gathered around for workshops on credit, savings, and entrepreneurship. The bank grew, slowly but steadily. And more importantly, it worked. Families who had never had access to fair loans now owned homes, small businesses opened, a single mother started a food truck, a high school senior used a microloan to launch a tutoring app, all because one man believed they were worth investing in. Walter never took a salary. He insisted the money be reinvested. When asked why, he said, "I've already been paid." In respect, Imani Carter, now the head of the bank's legal and outreach division, continued expanding their mission. She created a legal aid clinic inside the bank to help others facing the same institutional resistance Walter had overcome. Eventually, Walter was honored by the city. They named a day after him, Walter Brooks Day. But he just laughed and said, "Only thing I ever wanted named after me was that front door." Years later, when he passed away peacefully in his sleep, thousands attended his memorial. Not because he was rich, not because he was famous, but because he had given them something most institutions never could, a reason to believe. His legacy didn't live in vaults or stock numbers. It lived in every person who walked into that building and saw a photo of a man with a sack over his shoulder, smiling like he knew something the world had finally figured out. You can't underestimate a man who knows who he is. How many times have you judged someone by what they wore or didn't? How many times have you been judged, overlooked, dismissed, laughed at because of how you looked, where you came from, or what you carried on your shoulders? Walter Brooks didn't just prove them wrong. He proved what's possible when someone refuses to let the world decide their value. He walked into that bank invisible and walked out unforgettable. Now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever seen someone rise from nothing and become something no one expected? Share your story in the comments. Let's turn this space into a community where no one is invisible. And if Walter's journey moved you, even just a little, don't let it stop here. Like this video. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. Share it with someone who needs to remember that respect is earned not with noise, but with quiet strength. Because somewhere out there, another Walter is carrying a sack, and the world's just waiting to laugh until they can't anymore.